Imagine standing in the prehistoric forest at night, where a single roar is enough to stop your heart. The flickering firelight casts shadows on the faces of the first humans, not warriors, but tiny creatures learning how to protect each other from the fangs of darkness. It is the moment when humans began to understand that true strength does not lie in muscles, but in knowing how to stand together. If you want to explore with me how humans survived and evolved from that fear, hit subscribe and stay until the end of the video. Because tonight's story will make you reconsider what has made us human. When humans learned that fear could be shared, they inadvertently invented a tool more powerful than a stone club. That tool was trust. For the first time in a world where everything wanted to eat you, you began to believe that the one standing next to you would not. That small trust was a great step in evolution, and it is also the reason you are sitting safely here, listening to the story of your ancestors through a bright screen. The mornings of that era were never peaceful. The first sunlight over the savannah signaled hundreds of predators to begin their song. Who will die today? But amid the wind rustling through the grass and the cautious steps of lions, that tiny tribe had learned the rhythm of survival. The night watch signals. Someone gathers firewood, someone watches the children. All happened quietly, no words needed, because language had not yet formed, only silent consensus bound by shared fear. And then a miracle occurred. One night, as the fire was nearly out, someone reached out to throw in another branch. The rising embers reflected in everyone's eyes, a warm light, not just from the fire, but from the bond. They did not know they were creating society, but they felt something new, the sense that survival was not just about fleeing, but about existing together. From such instinctive acts, a rudimentary social structure gradually formed. Some gathered firewood, some went for water, some watched the sky to predict rain. No one was titled, but roles began to appear. That was when evolving intelligence began to surpass instinct. While most animals relied only on fangs and speed, humans discovered a more fearsome weapon, the ability to anticipate. They learned to observe, remember, and connect events. When an antelope ran in a certain direction, it was not random. It was a sign. When birds called from a tree, something might be coming. Those moments of awareness were the beginning of intelligence. And if you think intelligence was for creating art, it was not. At first, it was just to avoid being eaten. But that very fear, the emotion that keeps you alert at night, became the catalyst for human consciousness. While predators acted on reflex, humans began to act on memory. A child saw its father injured by approaching the river and remembered it. The next day, when the group approached the water, it pulled everyone back. No one understood why, but that action saved them. Experience became legacy, and collective memory gradually formed. Every scar, every scream, every night survived became a stream of data transmitted through action. No writing, no speech, just existing long enough for someone to imitate. But evolution never comes without a price. As intelligence grew, so did anxiety. Humans began to realize that they could lose each other, and in a world where death lurked every hour, the fear of loss was the first proof of affection. It was not just an instinct to protect others, it was the seed of morality. Saving Greg yesterday was unconscious, but this morning, seeing him smile, you felt something new, satisfaction, or perhaps joy. From this point, kindness was not just strategy, it became an emotion. Yet not everyone benefited from this invention. Groups that did not know how to cooperate gradually disappeared. Without trust, without sharing, they were removed from the food chain, not because they were weak, but because they were alone. Those who threw stones together, who feared together, were the ones who left the first footprints on the journey to becoming Homo sapiens. One of the strangest human advances was not inventing fire, but inventing waiting. When someone was injured, the group did not immediately leave. They paused, gathered leaves, fetched water, provided care. Meanwhile, predators still lurked, danger still surrounded them. Yet they accepted it. The price of kindness then was life itself, but they still paid. Somewhere in their instincts, they understood that one day they themselves would need to be waited for. That seemingly useless action created a biological change. When cooperation became a condition of survival, the human brain began to prioritize social emotions, empathy, loyalty, and guilt. Every hormone, every biochemical response in the body began to be reprogrammed for a single reason. If I help others, I will live longer. No moral lesson, only cold natural selection shaping humanity. And then, as the sun set once more, those first humans sat around the fire, listening to the echoes of wild beasts. They did not know that their trembling and fear were teaching them to become human. Every sigh, every protective gesture, every night they stayed awake together, all were the foundation of civilization. We, sitting behind screens millions of years later, are not so different from them. Still afraid of the dark, only now the darkness takes the form of bills, pressure, and loneliness. But deep within our DNA, the primordial lesson remains. Saving each other is the only way to survive. So if you're still watching, remember that hitting subscribe or leaving a comment not only signals the algorithm, it continues a millions of years old tradition of standing together. Stay tuned because the next part will show how from these small acts, humans took another step toward touching what makes us most distinct, humanity. On a misty dawn when the sun had just risen like a hesitant spark on the horizon, you and your tribe continued your journey. Bare feet left temporary marks on the damp ground, traces of those who dared to challenge nature. Every rustle in the grass made your heart race, not only from fear, but also from the awareness that now you were no longer alone. Fear had become an invisible thread connecting everyone, and that thread, somehow, had transformed a panicked herd into creatures capable of calculation, patience, and sharing. One day, when a child drew a giant beast on a rock wall, the entire tribe gathered. No one knew why, but the image reminded everyone of moments of fighting, fear, and victory. From that, art was born, not to beautify, but to remember, to remind that we had survived. Every carving on stone, every handprint smeared with ash was a declaration. I was here, and I was not eaten. Over time, the stories around the fire grew longer, richer. Some spoke of hunting trips, some spoke of gods and lightning, but all shared one thing: the belief that something greater was watching over them. When imagination and fear combined, religion was born, a system of belief helping humans explain the incomprehensible and endure the unchangeable, not because they needed a savior, but because they needed a reason to continue. Then one day, a strange idea appeared. Someone realized that by leaving signs for those who came after, carvings on trees, piles of stones marking paths, the whole tribe could survive more easily. From this, language began to take shape. At first, it was only warning shouts, then meaningful sounds, then stories. Language was the second fire, not warming the body, but warming the mind. Thanks to language, humans could not only convey information, but also emotions. Watch out, there's a tiger behind you. Became watch out, there's a giant tiger behind you that ate Greg last week. That exaggerated story made the group more alert, even laughed more. You had just invented two things: journalism and comedy. Then, along with language, trust spread. A group began leaving the tribe to seek new places, carrying stories, experiences, and sometimes mistakes. The human brain learned to store memories not only of oneself, but of the entire community. And so, history, clumsy and unannotated, began to be written through memory. Coordination, language, and compassion transformed humans into the strangest creatures on the planet, weak yet dominant, small yet resilient. While predators still relied on muscle power, you learned to rely on each other. One person falls, 10 others rise. A child gets lost, the whole tribe searches. You do not just fight to survive, you fight to protect the concept of us. And then, as an inevitable consequence, kindness became a survival strategy. Those who knew how to share were trusted. Those who were trusted were helped, and those who were helped lived longer, had children, and passed on that altruistic instinct. Humanity was rewired, not only to fear, but to care. Affection, perhaps, was evolution's most sophisticated invention. When night fell, you sat again by the fire. The fire was no longer just light, but collective memory, where humans realized that what kept them alive was not only warmth, but meaning. Fire warms the body, but stories warm the soul. And whenever a fire was lit far away, it signaled that another group of the same species was doing the same. From those fires, humanity gradually formed the first networks, not with cables or electronic waves, but with laughter, song, and promises to survive another night together. The first handshake, perhaps, was when two strangers met by the fire and realized they feared the same things. Then you realized the greatest thing. In a world where every creature tried not to be eaten, humans created something different. You did not just live to exist, you lived to belong. By keeping meaning for themselves, they stepped into a new era of humanity. From the first times of protecting each other from the fangs of wild beasts, a deeper seed arose, a sense of attachment, compassion, and gratitude. When a hand reaches out in the darkness, that act is no longer instinct. It is the beginning of culture. Death was no longer merely an end. When a member of the tribe fell, the others paused, placed their hands on the body, and whispered a few meaningless sounds, perhaps the first farewell in history. They covered the body with red earth, placed a few stones and tools beside it, as if the spirit still needed them somewhere else. No one taught them this, but compassion made them find ways to prolong the presence of the departed. From that moment, humans did not just know how to live, they began to know how to remember. The Neanderthals did this very early. They buried their peers, hunted together, and even cared for the weak. A healed, broken skeleton is evidence that someone had once carried it, fed it, and waited for it to recover. In the wild, this was not only humane, it was a revolutionary act. When compassion became a survival strategy, evolution opened a completely new branch: humans who know how to love. From there, seemingly small acts became the foundation of society. Someone taught children to avoid wolf packs. Someone stayed to care for the sick. Someone shared the last portion of food with the hungry. And when night fell, they told each other stories of the days gone by. Each story, whether distorted or exaggerated, carried a message. We are still together. The fire burned not only to drive away wild beasts, but also to keep human memory alive. Then one evening, as the wind blew across the vast grasslands, you, an ordinary Homo sapiens, looked toward a Neanderthal tribe lighting a fire in the distance. They were strong, rugged, yet somehow seemed lonelier. You realized that your species, though weaker, had something different: softness in the eyes, the ability to laugh in adversity, and the way people gathered even without clear reason. That softness, ironically, was true strength. Time passed, glaciers melted, forests changed, and those who once shared the plains with you disappeared. Perhaps from disease, perhaps from the weather, perhaps because of you. But no matter what, traces of them remained in your DNA, along with the lesson that caring is survival. From that moment, every step of evolution carried the warmth of compassion. Humans learned to share fire, food, and later stories, knowledge, religion, and art. Every civilization began with the same act: one person bending down to help another stand. Helping gradually became habit, then morality, then nature. We could no longer live any other way. And that is what made predators step back, not because we were stronger, but because we could turn fear into cooperation, pain into memory, and memory into meaning. Even when darkness still covered us, humans found reasons to light the way. Fire, language, music, rituals, all were different ways of saying, I see you. I am here with you. Today, when we sit in a quiet room reading that ancient history, we realize an unchanging truth: humans have never evolved alone. Every invention, every revolution, every civilization began with someone choosing not to abandon another. So, if you're listening to this story, remember that in every beat of your heart echoes the breath of ancestors who once stood between wild beasts and their fellow humans. They were not heroes, only those who knew how to hold hands in fear. And perhaps that is what makes us human. Therefore, before we continue the journey to explore other turning points in evolutionary history, hit subscribe and stay until the end of the video. Because the story of humanity is not just about the past, it is still being written every day in the moments you choose to help, share, and trust the person beside you. Can you imagine? Everything began with just a look, a gaze held longer than usual between two people standing in the darkness, listening to the same distant roar. In that moment, something strange happened. Fear became something shared. And when fear is shared, it is no longer fear, it becomes a bond. That is how trust was born, not from oaths, not from contracts, but from the look of those trying to survive the night. The first tribes had no philosophy. They did not speak of morality, nor did they know of society. Yet somehow they understood that standing together could slow death down a little. They did not know what humanity was, but they were creating it every night as they kept watch over the fire together, as they screamed together to scare off wild beasts. Even when they did not understand why, their bodies knew they belonged to each other. In that era, compassion had no name, but it had expression. A hand grasping the shoulder of someone about to fall, a piece of meat shared with one too weak to take it, a child carried across a river. These acts were small, but they changed the structure of the world. Because in the moment you choose to help someone, you are reshaping the future, not just for them, but for all humanity. But humanity never knew how to stop at simple things. When kindness became habit, we began to want to do better. When cooperation became effective, we sought ways to organize it. And when organization reached a large enough scale, we invented power. One day, someone in the tribe did not give orders merely because their voice was louder, but because others believed they should listen. That was the beginning of order, and also the beginning of conflict. Because the moment someone is heard, someone else is silenced. The moment someone is saved, someone else is left behind. The question our ancestors left from those nights around the fire still echoes today. Does kindness have limits? The answer, unfortunately, always changes. There are nights we save others even knowing we will go hungry. There are days we turn away believing it is the only way to protect the rest. That is the paradox of compassion. It is both what allows us to survive and what causes us anguish. From that, morality was born. Not from philosophers, but from humans trembling before the night, trying to understand what is right. When you hide an injured person in a cave, you have written the first chapter of humanitarian law. When you accept sharing the last portion of food, you have signed the first social contract without ink. And when you look into the eyes of a stranger and decide they are worth saving, you have invented the concept of us. But us is a fragile concept. It can be distorted by fear. When resources run low, us shrinks to my family, my tribe. And from that, war was born, not from malice, but from the instinct to protect one's kindness from the kindness of others. Another paradox of humanity: we kill each other to protect those we love. Yet the miracle is that through countless generations, that light has never gone out. Each time humanity hits rock bottom, compassion returns, quietly but persistently. In the Ice Age, it was hand in hand. In the Metal Age, it was a shield raised to protect another. In our era, perhaps it is a message, a small act in a noisy world. The form changes, but the essence does not. What sets us apart from predators is not strength or fangs, but the ability to choose each other, knowing that a price may be paid. Trust is the highest form of daring, and humans have chosen that daring for tens of thousands of years just to be together for one more night. If there is one lesson from the first tribes, it is this: survival has never been the goal. It is only the byproduct of caring for one another. Our ancestors understood this, even without saying it. They had no philosophy, no writing, but they had memories etched into instinct. Do not abandon each other. And it is those memories that have brought us here, to cities, to civilization, to the invisible connections between billions of people who have never met. We have traded torches for electricity, spears for satellites, yet we continue to seek the gaze of others in the darkness, a gaze that says, I am here with you. So, if you are listening to these words, remember, the story of humanity is never just about survival. It is about why we want each other to survive. And if you are curious about how kindness, fear, and the instinct to cooperate have created everything we call human, stay until the end of the video, hit subscribe, and continue this journey with me. Because perhaps while learning how our ancestors saved each other from wild beasts, we will learn how to save ourselves from the loneliness of the modern world. And then, like a familiar paradox of history, the people who once set up tents to heal the sick now erected an entire sacred state. In Prussia, the Teutonic Knights not only spread the faith, they redefined the concept of power. From initial compassion, they created a ruling mechanism based on absolute discipline and the belief that order is the highest form of mercy. To them, a soul converted by the sword was as valuable as a soul saved through prayer. And that was how they reconciled mercy and cruelty, by calling both a sacred duty. When the winter sun shone upon the red walls of Marienburg, the hammer and anvil echoed throughout the Nogat Valley. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly, forging iron armor and crosses. Every sword was inscribed with the words, In nomine Domini, in the name of the Lord. For the knights, fighting was not an act of violence, but the most powerful form of prayer. Within the fortress, every movement followed a rhythm as if God himself were watching. Meal times, prayer times, training times, all conducted with a precision that would make even the Holy Roman Emperor envious. In that picture, compassion had now been mechanized, becoming a sophisticated tool to maintain order. The warrior monks ruled not only with the sword, but also with penance and seal. They created detailed records of land, population, and taxes, things no one had previously considered in this wild borderland. Each village was built around a church. Each peasant had to give a tenth of their produce to faith. Yet within that system, there was a strange order. The people were protected from war, taught to read, and integrated into the emerging Christian economy. Compassion had become a tool of control. But after all, in a world full of violence, it was the only way to maintain peace. No one embodied this more than Hermann von Salza, the Grand Master who was simultaneously politician, theologian, and architect of the first Northern European Empire. He understood that faith could not be maintained by faith alone. Belief had to be reinforced with stone, brick, and law. Under his reign, Marienburg was not merely a fortress, but the center of a religious administrative machine. The knights were trained like monks, without emotion, without doubt, only duty. Yet, in the shadows of those walls, one human element remained, the belief that all austerity, all conquests were part of a mission greater than themselves. But that mission, like all missions in history, began to be distorted by its own success. As their borders expanded into Lithuanian lands, the Teutonic Knights began to believe they no longer served God, they represented him. Devotion became pride and discipline became chains. Once mercy was institutionalized, it lost its soul. People no longer healed out of empathy, but out of regulation, no longer saved for humanity, but for the reputation of the order. And when kindness became law, it could easily be turned into a weapon. The Northern Crusades lasted for centuries, burning pagan villages, forcing conversions, and leaving thousands of nameless graves behind. Each battle recorded in the monks' chronicles as a victory for faith, but for the local people, it was the end of the old world. Yet, in that ash, modern Europe began to take shape. From the towns of the Teutonic Order arose the first trading centers of the Baltic region. From their discipline emerged the concept of state and law. An empire built with blood, but also with vision. That order could conquer chaos. Yet, ironically, it was that very order that led to their decline. When loyalty was bound to power rather than faith, the knights began to forget why they wore the cross. They no longer saved people, they protected territory. No longer prayed for souls, they collected taxes to feed their army. And when compassion was replaced by ambition, collapse became only a matter of time. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410, when the Polish-Lithuanian alliance defeated the Teutonic Order, was not only a military defeat, but a symbol of a deeper truth. Mercy, when used as a tool of power, will devour itself. However, their legacy survived, not in swords or castles, but in ideas. They redefined salvation, not only as a matter between humans and God, but also as the relationship between humans themselves. From the harshness of the Teutonic Order, Europe learned the value of discipline. From their misapplied compassion, humanity learned the lesson of the limits of trust. And above all, they remind us that even when kindness is tainted by power, its seed remains, waiting for the day it will be sown again in people who understand that true strength does not come from domination, but from the ability to save each other. Today, when you look upon the remaining red brick fortresses in Malbork or Elbląg, you do not only see the relics of war, but the memory of compassion weaponized, a reminder that in human history, the line between helping and controlling has always been as fragile as the thread of trust in the ancient knight. Yet it is from that fragility that humanity endures, because in the end, we still choose to stand together, even when it means facing the whole world. After the Battle of Grunwald, the seemingly eternal empire of the Teutonic Knights began to rot from within. They still had their fortresses, their black crosses, the magnificent red brick walls of Marienburg, but the soul was depleted. In history, some wounds do not bleed, yet can still bring an empire to its knees. For the Order, the defeat at Grunwald was that wound. They lost not only victory, but also the ideals that had sustained their existence. Once the vow to fight for God was twisted into fight for power, faith was no longer a guiding flame, but merely a mask for ambition. After 1410, the Teutonic Order gradually became what they once despised, a secular bureaucratic machine. They signed treaties, bribed lords, levied taxes, tasks that secular rulers carried out daily. The knights were no longer warriors of faith, but officials in armor. Many fortresses were abandoned. Treasuries dwindled under military expenses, and the sound of hymns now mingled with the complaints of merchants and peasants, those forced to pay for crusades that never reached their destination. Even the Pope, who had once blessed them, remained silent. For by that time, Europe had changed. The Crusades had become the past, and commerce, not religion, was shaping the world. In cities like Danzig and Elbing, the Hanseatic merchants began to wield more influence than the knights. They sought freedom to trade, unwilling to be bound by the old crusading treaties. And so, when the knights tried to maintain power through outdated laws, their own Christian citizens rose against them. In 1454, a rebellion erupted, known as the 13 Years' War, when an alliance of Prussian cities nobility, backed by Poland, declared the Teutonic Order's rule null. Ironically, those who had sworn loyalty to God were now fighting against the men of God. When the war ended, the Teutonic Order had to kneel and sign the Treaty of Thorn in 1466, ending their golden age forever. Under the treaty, they had to cede most of their lands to the Kingdom of Poland and swear allegiance to the Polish king. Marienburg, a symbol of power, became the victor's headquarters. The order moved its capital to Königsberg, a smaller, colder city laden with symbolic meaning. From this point, they were no longer an empire, but a religious military organization under supervision. From a glorious cathedral, they had become a shadow of themselves. Yet history has never lacked ironic chapters. In the 16th century, as Europe shook under the Reformation, it was the Teutonic Order, the organization that had once deemed fighting heresy a sacred mission, that was swept up in the storm. Their last Grand Master in Prussia, Albert of Brandenburg, a well-educated man attuned to the movements of the age, did the unthinkable. He dissolved the order in Prussia, renounced his vows, married, and turned their land into the Duchy of Prussia under Polish authority. A monk became a duke. A crusading empire became the first secular state in Central Europe. This transformation marked not only the end of the Teutonic Order as a religious force, but also the beginning of the era of nation-states, where power was defined no longer by the cross, but by maps and taxes. Yet their legacy continued to exist in quiet and unsettling ways. The castles they built still stand through the centuries, like Malbork, now recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. The towns they founded, such as Danzig, Gdańsk, became European trade centers, and the concept of an orderly military religious state that they once pioneered planted seeds for many future empires, from Prussia to Nazi Germany. In hindsight, the Teutonic Order was not only a symbol of piety, but also proof of how ideals can be corrupted by power. An order born of compassion ended in domination, and it is in that paradox that history finds its meaning. Just as early humans learned to save one another from the fangs of wild beasts, the Teutonic Order was initially founded to save people, only to gradually become a new predatory force. Their story serves as a mirror for all civilizations. No ideal can endure without mercy. You can build higher walls, forge stronger armor, even invoke God to legitimize power. But if you lose the empathy that once made you human, you are left only as a shell wrapped in symbols. Now imagine, if the first monks under the hot Holy Land sun in 1190 could see the future of their order, what would they think? They had pitched tents to save people, not to build an empire. They had washed wounds with water, not with blood. But history, as always, cares little for initial purity. It only remembers those strong enough to rewrite it. And across centuries, the Teutonic Black Cross has left a long mark in human memory, both brilliant and dark. So when you look at the massive Gothic fortresses in the north, remember they are not merely architectural feats. They are stone inscriptions of pride, of the illusion that one can save the world with discipline and iron. But perhaps the greatest lesson from their story is one humanity has learned since ancient times. True survival does not come from strength, but from the ability to hold another's hand in the darkness. If you want to continue exploring historical stories like this with me, where compassion, power, and tragedy intersect, subscribe to the Historical Secrets channel. For the past never sleeps, and sometimes understanding how an empire falls is the best way to understand why we still endure. Under the gray skies of the Baltic Sea, the castles and fortresses of the Teutonic Order still stood tall, but the atmosphere within had profoundly changed. Marienburg, once a symbol of divine power, was now only a shadow of itself, where the echoes of hymns had been replaced by the rustle of paperwork and ledgers. Grandmaster Hinrich von Plauen, who had once led the knights with iron strength, now faced a harsh reality. The network of power and wealth they had painstakingly built was cracking from within. Peasants, merchants, and local nobles who had once respected religious law now saw only cruelty and greed. Sacred oaths had been twisted to serve taxation and political purposes. The knights, once models of discipline, had become rigid and isolated, fighting not against outsiders but against their own people. Every wall, every corridor, once symbols of order and authority, now bore witness only to the collapse of pride. Meanwhile, the world outside kept moving forward. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance rose as a dominant power, while the Hanseatic League, a smart and flexible trade network, surpassed the Teutonic Knights in every aspect, from economy to diplomacy. The proud knights refused to adapt. They still dreamed of crusades, while Europe spoke in the language of profit, politics, and adaptation to the new era. Continuous humiliation throughout the 15th century turned the order from a feared force into a weary bureaucratic apparatus. When the Prussian subjects rebelled during the 13 Years' War, they turned to Poland for protection. And finally, in 1466, the Teutonic Order had to accept becoming a vassal of the Polish crown. The Grand Master had to kneel, relinquish most of his power, and swear loyalty before the King of Poland, a scene that would have shaken any founder of the order. In the following years, the proud order retained remnants of authority, but the warrior spirit and dreams had vanished. The Marienburg fortress, symbol of divine power, had become nothing more than a treasury and office. White cloaks had faded to gray. The black cross felt heavier than ever, no longer radiating the glow of victory, but only the marks of fallen power. The knights still observed rituals, still wore armor, but their role was now only administration, inspection, and maintaining legal order, not expanding faith or territory. By the early 16th century, as the Protestant Reformation rose, the Teutonic Order faced an era where vows of chastity, obedience, and fighting for God were no longer the preferred language. Martin Luther broke the old world with preaching instead of the sword, and Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, the young Grand Master of the Order, realized that past glory no longer fit the present. He did not choose to decay silently, but actively adapted. In 1525, following Luther's advice, Albert renounced his monastic vows, converted to Protestantism, and turned the Teutonic lands of Prussia into a secular duchy under Poland. This act ended the role of the warrior knights and laid the foundation for a new state. On April 10, 1525, Albert knelt before King Sigismund, a scene both humiliating and strategic, demonstrating the transformation from religious power to political and pragmatic authority. Yet the Teutonic Order did not entirely disappear. Monks who refused to follow Albert found a place within the Holy Roman Empire, where they became symbols of tradition rather than sovereignty. The legend of the Black Cross and white robes persisted, not on battlefields, but in chapels, hospitals, and charitable organizations. Ironically, they returned to their roots, caring for the sick, educating and practicing faith, rather than conquering and ruling. They became proof that survival and adaptation, not victory or absolute power, were the paths to leaving a lasting mark in history. The castles still stood as witnesses to the past, red bricks resisting time, but now only as cultural symbols, no longer instruments of conquest. The Teutonic legacy remained etched on the Baltic territories and successor states, from the Duchy of Prussia to the Kingdom of Prussia, and later the German Empire. Discipline, militarization, and belief in a sacred mission, once the order's strength, were transformed into military and political values in the successor states. The Black Cross reappeared on medals and military insignia, no longer to expand territory, but to commemorate and preserve tradition. Through its rise and fall, the Teutonic Order became a model of medieval paradox, simultaneously civilizing and destructive, scholarly and martial, confessing and conquering. In their glory, one sees organizational genius. In their collapse, the consequences of pride. Their legacy is a reminder of the inseparable connection between faith and power, that when these two elements blindly merge, the result can be both glory and disaster. Yet it is also through adaptation and transformation that the Teutonic Order found new life, from crusading warriors to caretakers, from religious power to social and political responsibility. The remaining castles, fortresses, and Gothic churches are not merely architectural objects, but living testimonies to the Order's story of contradictions. The rigidity of discipline, the pride of warriors, the greed of power, and the adaptability of those who recognized that the times had changed. They remind us that power, even when cloaked in faith, cannot endure forever without flexibility, humility, and the ability to learn from failure. In the shadow of history, the Teutonic Order remains, a legend both brilliant and dark, leaving posterity lessons on greatness, collapse, and the rebirth of an organization that once shook the Baltic with strength, faith, and pride. Inside the magnificent castles of the Middle Ages, every detail, from the faintest fragrance to the light reflecting off silver and gold, was orchestrated to emphasize power and status. The space was not merely a place of living, it was a stage for subtle struggles, engaging sight, smell, and sound. Fragrance, an invisible luxury, was used skillfully to distinguish the nobility from the outside world. While peasants could only sense the scents of fields, ripe grain, and hearth smoke, the nobility was surrounded by expensive imported aromas, rare incense, rose oil, amber resin, or even rare essential oils from India and the East. These scents were not only pleasing but also signals of power. They proclaimed that the owner was not only wealthy but also favored by the divine and born to rule. Every step into a room, every glide of a glove perfumed with fragrance reminded all that this was a world entirely different from the humble huts of common folk. Noble attire in the Middle Ages operated on the same principle. Every thread, every fold was calculated to convey authority, prestige, and influence. Cloaks, mantles, hats, and necklaces were not merely clothing, they were tangible political weapons. Florentine silk, Tyrian purple, Venetian red, or gold thread, meticulously woven by Italian, Flemish, or Spanish artisans, symbolized craftsmanship and wealth. The mere material value of these items was enough to turn each outfit into a statement. By looking at the wearer, one could discern their class, level of power, and whether their authority was sacred or merely superficial. It was no coincidence that coronation robes became moving relics. The shimmer of gold thread, gemstones, or fur not only decorated but transformed the wearer into a living legend. Noble women, especially queens and princesses, used fashion as a form of diplomacy. A hand-embroidered Florentine silk robe could subtly convey wealth and alliances with southern countries. A garment imported from England could assert authority and prestige locally. Puffy sleeves, high collars, pearl-studded belts, and rare necklaces were not merely decorative, but sophisticated tools to project power, control impressions, and guide political relationships. Fashion in the hands of powerful queens like Isabella of France or Eleanor of Aquitaine was a strategic weapon, turning audiences, festivals, or banquets into covert battles of influence and authority. A color, a fold, or a misplaced gemstone could spark rumors or offend an important ally, proving that power in the Middle Ages was built not only with the sword, but also with sight, choice, and metaphor. Noble feasts were staged with the same spirit. No one ate simply to satisfy physiological needs. Every banquet was a diplomatic stage, a performance of power, wealth, and strategy. Long tables, embroidered tablecloths, massive chandeliers, and dozens to hundreds of servants operated in perfect sequence to reinforce order and hierarchy. The food was extravagantly absurd. Whole roasted swans, decorated peacocks, meat pies with live birds exploding like fireworks, and wine, fruit juices, or rare spiced waters became tools to signify authority. Every detail, seating arrangements, the way wine was served, the distribution of dishes contained political messages. Sitting in the wrong place was a sign of humiliation. Sitting too close or too far from the host was a test of relations, a sophisticated, strategic game that every noble had to learn to read and interpret. Castles were the center of all these orchestrations. They were not just fortresses, but theaters, arenas, and stone proclamations. Gates, high towers, and winding corridors were not only for defense, but also psychological training. Anyone entering had to look up, to feel the grandeur and encompassing power. Noble chambers were designed to demonstrate absolute distinction from commoners. Vaulted ceilings, imported bricks and stones, rare stained glass, intricate sculptures, all reminded that not everyone was worthy to touch these spaces. Luxury was designed to the extent that a village could live an entire lifetime without ever seeing it. Every detail, gargoyle, carved column, or small window, served the purpose of training obedience and reinforcing social hierarchy. The Great Hall was the soul of the castle, where feasts, audiences, celebrations, and even political decisions took place. Walls were adorned with enormous tapestries depicting victories, biblical stories, or family crests, partly to impress and partly to remind everyone that they lived within a colossal artwork of power. In this space, one could clearly see that power in the Middle Ages was the synthesis of architecture, clothing, fragrance, food, and ritual, a sophisticated system where every action, every object conveyed a silent message. And from this extravagance, from light reflecting off gold and silver and candlelight, from Eastern perfumes to embroidered gold garments, one could perceive a world where power existed through all the senses, not only through weapons or law, but through art, strategy, and human psychology. Upon entering a castle, one immediately realizes that everything, from the floor stones to the light streaming through stained glass windows, is orchestrated to highlight power and status. The floors are strewn with reeds and aromatic herbs, from lavender to mint, not only to mask unpleasant odors, but also to create a luxurious space where every step feels like walking on a heavenly carpet. The smoke of beeswax candles hangs in the air, flickering light reflecting off gilded objects, creating a space both mystical and opulent. The nobles' private chambers are not merely places of rest. Four-poster beds draped in silk or velvet become symbols of status and refined decoration. In many courts, distinguished guests were received not in the throne room, but in the lord's bedroom, signaling a blend of power and intimacy that blurred the line between family life and royal ceremony. Even the lavatories were meticulously designed, with carved wooden seats and views over the countryside, where even comfort in mundane moments had to become a symbol of authority. The castle courtyard served as another stage where the nobility displayed their wealth and power. Imported rose gardens, saint-shaped fountains, and rooms housing exotic animals such as lions, falcons, or even bears were not merely for personal pleasure, but to demonstrate status and authority. The castle, from its sturdy stone walls to winding corridors, was not only a fortress, but a psychological instrument, compelling all visitors to look up and feel the grandeur. The lighting within the castle was carefully managed, reflecting off gold, silver, porcelain, and gemstones, creating a glittering space where wealth and power became tangible. Everything that sparkled, from crowns to cups, conveyed messages of authority and divine favor. Gold, the era's dominant metal, was not only currency but a symbol appearing everywhere. Belts, clasps, shoes, religious texts, saddles, even dining sets entirely of gold, all demonstrating wealth and influence. Cuisine was an inseparable part of the art of displaying power. A noble feast was not merely about eating, it was a stage for politics, diplomacy, and status display. Extravagant dishes, from whole roasted swans, decorated peacocks, meat pies containing live birds, to wines infused with rare spices, were designed to stimulate all the senses and send messages of wealth, sophistication, and power. Every bite, every sip conveyed messages about social order. Seating arrangements, food distribution, and even the use of knives and forks contained subtle political meaning. These feasts were strategic balls, where every whisper, glance, and gesture was read like a map of power. Hosts supervised, observing all behavior to ensure their impression of authority was reinforced through every detail. Jewelry and personal accessories followed the same logic. Brooches, rings, necklaces, even crosses and rosaries were set with gemstones, each carrying symbolic meaning. Rubies representing courage, emeralds for fertility, jade for heavenly favor. A queen's necklace could be a political statement, reminding of alliances or territorial claims. The line between piety and pride blurred, for in the Middle Ages, virtue was displayed through splendor, and devotion looked its best when adorned with diamonds and gold. Churches followed the same logic. Gold plated chalices, gem encrusted reliquaries, and ornate altars all publicly proclaimed the wealth and virtue of the donor. An altar could symbolize the entire taxes of a town, showing how nobles and lords built their image before the public while investing in relationships with the divine. Light reflecting off gold and gemstones was not merely decorative, it was proof that those possessing these objects were favored by God and protected in both earthly life and the afterlife. Hunting, an extravagant outdoor pastime, was another form of power display. Nobles did not hunt for food, but to assert status. Hunts were staged like plays, where silk and velvet met mud, falcons and hounds accompanied humans. Hunting was a privilege protected by law and tradition. Forests were royal domains, and peasants who poached could face death. Kings like Edward I of England or Philip II of France maintained entire teams of falconers, gamekeepers, and stable staff to ensure that each spectacle unfolded according to plan. Every expedition, every hunt, every hunted animal was a message of power, demonstrating dominion not only over territory but over societal perception. Opulence in castles, from beds, reception rooms, dining tables, jewelry to hunting, was organized like a sophisticated play, where power was expressed through every sense and action. In this world, status was proven not only through the sword or law, but through display, light, fragrance, and performative art. A medieval noble lived in a universe where every object, every action, every detail carried a message. Power, power, and only power. And through these lurid experiences, anyone entering a castle realized they were witnessing a perfected version of society, where wealth, status, and politics merged into a vivid, sophisticated, and inimitable art form. Under the medieval sky, the luxury of the nobility extended far beyond magnificent castles or gilded feasts. Every detail, from a trained horse to a silver-studded bridle, from falcons to finely crafted arrows, was a symbol of power, both ostentatious and cautionary. The art of hunting, especially falconry, represented the pinnacle of sophistication and skill. A noble falcon, raised, trained, and exchanged between kingdoms, was a living symbol of status, more valuable than castles or land. The bird served not only for entertainment, but also reminded everyone that power was measured not just by armies or laws, but by mastery over nature, control over life and death. Falconers were revered almost as saints, for the skill of taming and controlling such rare birds of prey was nothing short of miraculous. Hunting was not merely about killing animals, it was a sophisticated social performance. Lords invited allies or rivals to participate, turning the outdoor game into a test of grace, courage, and endurance. A fall from a horse or a missed arrow could become court gossip, while a daring success could elevate one's reputation faster than any treaty or sermon. When the hunt ended, feasting became the next performance. Venison displayed with care, trophies paraded through the hall, and minstrels immortalized the day with poetry and music. Every aspect of the hunt was a political play. Power was expressed through display, refinement, and bravery, all within the embrace of nature. Nobles did not merely own land, they owned landscapes and wilderness, asserting power like God, ruling over both humans and beasts. The luxury of the medieval nobility was also entwined with religion, serving as the perfect veneer for wealth. A gem-encrusted chalice or gilded altar was not merely a religious object, but a declaration of power and prestige. The church and the nobility existed in a symbiotic relationship between virtue and authority. Funding grand churches, monasteries, or pilgrimages was not only an act of piety, but also a demonstration of wealth and a means of maintaining reputation. Every magnificent altar, every jewel-covered relic testified to bank accounts, strategic intelligence, and public piety. A noble constructing an elaborate chapel, decorating ceilings with saintly frescoes woven in gold, sent a message to heaven while humbling jealous rivals, reminding the world that power and virtue could coexist, provided they were presented correctly. Even funerals and pilgrimages were part of the luxurious performance. Noble tombs were not merely resting places, but works of art, combining sculpture, inscriptions, and stained glass to convey eternal power and virtue. Pilgrimages, such as to Santiago de Compostela or Rome, became mobile fashion shows. Nobles rode horses in silk garments, attendants carrying luxury goods, relics, and souvenirs serving as proof of prestige and influence. Such journeys could elevate a family's reputation for life, sometimes more than any battle or treaty. Some clever nobles even sponsored others to undertake pilgrimages on their behalf, turning sanctity into a transactional act while preserving an image of piety and authority. Churches, therefore, became mirrors reflecting wealth, grand, luxurious, sometimes excessively glittering, yet always harboring subtle power. Medieval luxury was a complex network of religion, politics, and performance. Crowns, gilded robes, sparkling dining tables, falcons, hunts, and churches all merged into a sophisticated symbolic system. Every action, every object conveyed a message: who you were, what you owned, and where you stood in the social order. Wealth was not personal pleasure, it was a survival strategy. A deficiency in any detail could result in loss of reputation, power, or even the downfall of a family. Extravagant feasts, lavish clothing, and hunts were the language the nobility used to communicate, negotiate, challenge, and dominate. Yet behind this splendor lay constant pressure. Every gemstone, falcon, and gilded altar reminded that wealth had to be maintained, power reinforced, and image kept radiant. Many noble families fell into debt, forced to sell estates or marry strategically to sustain the performance. Poets and clerics warned against vanity, yet even they could not resist the allure of gold, silver, and glittering light. The medieval noble world was paradoxical. Everyone condemned extravagance, yet no one dared to abandon it. It was a weapon, armor, language, and code of life. By the 15th century, many kingdoms began to decline, and noble luxury gradually faded. Yet the spirit, meticulousness, and art of performing power lingered in castles, palaces, and churches. Even as gold tarnished and silk wore thin, the legacy of opulence glimmered faintly, reminding future generations that once power, virtue, and wealth merged into a living art form. In this world, nobles did not merely exist. They lived to perform, to dominate, and to create a legend where every gaze, every fragrance, and every step proclaimed authority. The power of the Knights Templar, from their humble beginnings with the goal of protecting pilgrims, had grown into a sophisticated financial machine, spreading throughout Europe and the Levant. They were not only warriors of Christ, but also money managers, the accountants of heaven, turning faith into a tool for ensuring security and authority. Their fortresses were not merely bastions against enemies, but also the central banks of the medieval world. In the dark cellars beneath solemn chapels, chests of money, silver ingots, and sealed documents held mountains of gold, safeguarding the wealth of nobles, bishops, and even kings. Even Philip the Fair of France trusted them with his treasury, a decision both risky and a testament to the financial power of the order. This network operated on trust and reputation, intangible assets more powerful than any weapon. In a world where banks did not exist in the modern sense, the ability to protect, manage, and multiply money safely was both extraordinary and immensely powerful. Nobles, merchants, and even monarchs relied on the Knights Templar as an empire, ensuring the survival of their assets and prestige. A pilgrim could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. A king could borrow gold for war without fear of loss. Receipts, deposits, and promissory notes were encoded with secret symbols, astounding modern accountants. Even in an age of widespread illiteracy, understanding the system allowed anyone to participate in this sophisticated financial network. But it was not just money that gave the knights their power. Their presence on the battlefield, in palaces, or amid the Crusades was a reminder that power and virtue could coexist. Each fortress was a training center where knights learned to balance combat skills with financial management. Every meticulously kept document proved that precision, discipline, and loyalty to contracts were more formidable weapons than swords. These intangible elements made them an elusive force, guardians, creditors, and economic centers all at once. Their luxury was also part of a power strategy. Headquarters and fortresses were elaborately decorated, each chapel and room reflecting the order's strength and prestige. Massive treasuries were rigorously guarded, locks encoded, keys carefully distributed, and the amount of gold and silver meticulously recorded. Beyond strict security, the knights were also shrewd investors. They lent money to merchants to maintain pilgrim convoys, funded lords building castles, and supported kings financing wars or crusades. Their money flowed throughout Europe, permeating every layer of society, from peasants working on the order's lands to vineyards supplying wine for the nobility. They were the financial lifeblood of the continent, creating invisible but omnipresent power. However, the power of wealth also brought peril. As the Knights Templar grew richer and more powerful, envy increased. Kings and popes, initially supportive, began to fear their power was beyond control. The red cross on their cloaks, once a symbol of sacrifice, became the target of ambition, struggle, and even conspiracy. The combination of military power, financial authority, and sacred reputation created an almost invulnerable image, but one that was extremely dangerous. In palaces, at lavish feasts, and during crusades, the knights were both saviors and creditors. They managed royal treasuries, lent money for wars, built fortresses, and financed distant pilgrimages. King John of England, known for his hot temper and habit of heavy taxation, even relied on the order to manage royal revenue and safeguard his personal assets. No one could deny that in a chaotic world, the Knights Templar maintained financial order, where power was ensured through signatures, seals, and oaths. The combination of military and financial power made the Knights a unique organization in history, not only fighting to protect faith, but also to protect money, reputation, and social order. They created a standard that modern banks could only dream of: safety, credibility, and operational capacity on a vast scale. Their influence permeated Europe, from mountain fortresses to cities, from remote castles to bustling trade centers, making them both a financial and military empire. Yet, precisely because they did not conceal their wealth, the Knights Templar faced their own tragedy. When power became too great, envy and greed crept in. By the late 13th century, the knights were no longer merely holy warriors protecting pilgrims. They became symbols of power, wealth, and danger that any king or pope had to approach cautiously. The combination of faith and finance, once their strength, became the cause of their ultimate downfall. Over centuries, the Knights Templar proved one thing. In the Middle Ages, power was built not only on the sword, but also on signatures, treasuries, and trust. They created an economic model intertwined with divine authority, turning faith into a tool of control and financial power into a sacred symbol. And although their ultimate fate was tragic, their legacy of management, finance, trust, and social influence still resonates, reminding posterity of an era when faith and money merged to create unprecedented might. The fall of the Knights Templar is a tragedy perfectly orchestrated from power, ambition, and envy. When King Philip IV of France, a clever but ambitious monarch, realized that his enormous debt to the order had made them a force no one, not even he, could control, he began to find ways to reverse the balance of power. The Paris Temple, once the financial center of Europe and a symbol of absolute prestige, now became the focal point of intrigue. Treasures, account books, and assets of kings, nobles, and merchants were all in the hands of men loyal only to the Pope. This was a direct challenge to royal authority, and Philip would never accept that an independent, holy, and wealthy organization could place him in debt and dependency. Philip's strategy combined political power with media and superstition. First, he launched sophisticated propaganda campaigns, spreading rumors of heresy, greed, and mysterious rituals among the Knights Templar. Stories of lost relics, the Ark of the Covenant, and allegedly heretical rites created waves of fear and suspicion among the public. In an era where religion dominated every aspect of life, doubt about faith was the most powerful political tool. People saw the red cross on the knights' cloaks no longer as a symbol of sacrifice and faith, but as a sign of dangerous mysteries, powers beyond their control. Trust, which had built the order's economic and social power, now became a double-edged sword, making them both revered and hunted. On October 13th, 1307, associated with the superstition of Friday the 13th, Philip acted swiftly and ruthlessly. Orders for mass arrests were issued, targeting all knights, from young warriors to seasoned masters. Within hours, their once impenetrable fortresses were breached, and those who had been symbols of loyalty, integrity, and financial power became prisoners of royal authority. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and devil worship were carefully constructed using the power of medieval media to convince the public and the church that the Knights Templar were a genuine threat. Torture began immediately. The knights, who had once sworn absolute loyalty, were forced to confess to crimes they had never committed. Master Jacques de Molay, nearly 70 years old and embodying all the pride and prestige of the order, was shackled in the Paris temple, which he had once regarded as a fortress and center of power. In pain, many knights confessed to acts of heresy, even worshipping imaginary figures like Baphomet. These confessions, prolonged through suffering and torture, became fabricated evidence, but to the public, truth was replaced by tragic, horrifying, and compelling stories. Philip's cruelty targeted not only the body but also the spirit and prestige of the order. Treasures, account books, and assets managed by the Knights Templar suddenly became strategic targets. Gold and silver were seized, loyalists expelled, and accusations of heresy were turned into justifications in the eyes of the Church. Pope Clement, initially neutral, was forced to side with the king, demonstrating the political power of the order beyond control. This clearly showed that economic power, no matter how great, could be destroyed by politics without absolute protection. Ironically, what had made the order strong, their financial independence, honesty in accounting, ability to manage and distribute assets over a vast area, now became the reason for their tragedy. The knights, once symbols of trust and prestige, were now seen as to all surrounding secular and religious powers. They had built a financial empire based on trust and discipline, yet lacked mechanisms to protect against the greed and authority of kings. The combination of success and mystery made them the perfect target, where a single misstep could destroy an entire powerful organization. Legally, the Knights Templar disappeared, but their influence and legend endured. They left a profound historical lesson. Power comes not only from armies or faith, but also from the ability to control the flow of money and information. When greed and power combine, even the strongest religious and financial organizations can become victims. The fall of the Knights Templar demonstrates that in any society, wealth and power always carry risk, and that financial independence, no matter how strong, cannot exist beyond the reach of politics. Legends of treasure, secret tunnels, and hidden relics continue to circulate, turning the Knights Templar into symbols of mystery, power, and tragedy. It is said that the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount have never been fully explored, and that much of the wealth remains hidden in abandoned fortresses. But the real marvel lies in how they turned faith into a financial tool, trust into power, and moral principles into the foundation of an economic empire far ahead of their time. Overall, the story of the Knights Templar is a testament to a profound paradox. Strength, power, and holiness, even when perfectly combined, are not immune to greed, political authority, and suspicion. The Knights Templar, from humble warriors protecting pilgrims, became treasury managers, financial warriors, and ultimately victims of the very power they created. They teach posterity a valuable lesson. Independence, power, and prestige, no matter how formidable, require balance and protection, or fate can turn at any moment by a political hammer and a sealed command. Although the Knights Templar fell in reality, they left an indelible mark on how an organization can combine faith, intellect, finance, and power. They were not merely knights, but symbols of the strength of trust, discipline, and the ability to control wealth in a chaotic world. The legends about them still resonate, reminding us that in history, financial and political power always go hand in hand, and the one who controls the money is sometimes the one who holds the real power. The disappearance of the Knights Templar was not only the end of an organization, but also the beginning of a legend that would live on in the imagination of Europe. As dawn broke on October 13, 1307, no noble, no merchant, and certainly no knight could have guessed that in just a few hours, a power built over 2 centuries would be obliterated. The Paris Temple, a formidable fortress that had once safeguarded the treasures of kings and become the financial center of Europe, had now turned into a scene of horror. The underground chambers, once filled with gold, silver, jewels, and intricate financial records, became mysteriously empty. Although Philip IV ordered the confiscation of all assets, the enormous gold held by the order seemed to have vanished, and the question of the treasure's true fate became the source of countless rumors and legends. Some say that the knights, with their innate wisdom and discipline, had managed to transfer the most valuable portions to secret allies in England, Portugal, or even Scotland. The underground tunnels beneath the Paris Temple, cleverly constructed to both protect assets and maintain secrecy, became legendary. Some historians believe these tunnels not only facilitated the movement of wealth, but also served as repositories for knowledge, ledgers, and crucial financial records, intellectual heritage that the knights had built over centuries. While most of the public saw only gold and silver, those in the know understood that the true power of the Templars lay not in treasure, but in the system of management, credit, and information they developed, a rudimentary banking and accounting system that laid the foundation for modern European finance. The trials of the Knights Templar, spanning 7 years, were ruthless and skillful political theater. Every confession was coerced under torture, every knight forced to publicly renounce faith, all serving Philip the Fourth's purpose to eliminate an uncontrollable force and seize their immense wealth. Yet, though their bodies were crushed under chains and fire, their spirit and honor endured. Many retracted their confessions, asserting their innocence before sentencing, and in the death of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Order, declarations of integrity and faith in God's justice echoed forever. As he stood on the pyre, refusing to beg for mercy and cursing both the king and the pope, it was not only a courageous act, but also the final symbol of the values the order had pursued: faith, loyalty, and honor that could not be bought. But this downfall also left a dual legacy. On one hand, the Knights Templar vanished legally, their assets seized, and their organization dismantled. On the other, they lived on in the imagination of Europe. Legends of lost treasure, secret underground chambers, legendary relics, and the never-found Ark of the Covenant created the image of a secretive order that was both sacred and dangerous. Stories of secret voyages to the Atlantic, of knights finding refuge under King Robert the Bruce, or the covert protection of King Dinis in Portugal are not merely myths. They are evidence of the order's survival skills, intelligence, and long-term vision. The knights knew that power and survival depended not only on the sword, but also on secrecy, asset management, and the ability to coordinate resources. The most remarkable aspect is their lasting influence on the modern world. The credit systems, asset management, and international banking methods they developed laid the groundwork for modern banking, insurance, and accounting. Those who were burned for heresy, caught in the deceit of politics and media, in fact inspired the standardized financial management systems that followed. In an era when the church controlled nearly every aspect of life, the knights demonstrated that faith could combine with knowledge and finance to create social power beyond imagination. The legend of the Knights Templar also persisted in culture and imagination for centuries. From alchemy, Freemasonry, and the Holy Grail to stories of hidden treasure, all became associated with the image of wealthy, mysterious, and inviolable knights. They became idealized figures in human imagination, a secretive order both noble and mystical, possessing unparalleled power, yet hunted by envy and greed. These stories remind us that in history, true power lies not only in crowns or swords, but also in knowledge, the ability to manage and protect information, and foresight beyond one's rivals. The fall of the Knights Templar, though marked by human cruelty, simultaneously attests to the immortal power of spiritual and intellectual legacy. When the flames of 1314 died down, Europe was left with two mysteries: the disappearance of the Templar treasure and the endurance of the legend. The knights were massacred, yet their ideas and influence lived on in exploration fleets, in banking systems, and in oral stories of power, secrecy, and honor. The legend of the Knights Templar proves that true values are not found in gold or temporary power, but in intelligence, faith, and the ability to create a sustainable system that outlasts time, power, and death. Through it all, the Knights Templar demonstrated that an organization can become immortal not through physical strength or the sword, but through the creation of intellectual and spiritual legacy, generating living legends in human imagination and culture. They began with vows of poverty and absolute loyalty, yet ended with a timeless legacy, from faith to finance, from warfare to exploration, and from reality to legend. It is through the combination of courage, intellect, and secrecy that the Knights Templar became an immortal symbol, a vivid testament that power, knowledge, and faith, when organized and protected, can endure forever despite all the cruelty of the world.